Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy and the Power Transformation Lab. My name is Michael Davidson. I'm an associate professor here at UC San Diego at GPS, as well as the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department. And I am delighted to welcome you all and moderate this session today. So across Southeast Asia, electricity demand is growing rapidly. We saw 7% growth last year and is projected to rise at least 4% over the next decade. This could account for a quarter of all global energy demand growth in that time. Much of this growth has been met by coal. Coal's mix already supplies 60% of electricity in select countries and half in Vietnam. And at the same time, nearly all ASEAN countries have pledged carbon neutrality or net zero emissions around mid-century or thereabouts. But energy investment in the region would need to double in order to achieve these levels. So when there is a tension arising here that we're going to dig into today between the booming electricity demand, the continued coal dependence, and these rising climate ambitions from countries in the regions. And it'll be a pivotal test to see how we can turn these climate pledges into real world low carbon power and industrial pathways. And we're holding this webinar as COP30 in Brazil is underway, and the world is looking for signs of forward momentum on the climate crisis. And many countries, including Vietnam and Indonesia, have submitted their new climate targets called Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. And so we are fortunate today to have three leading experts in this domain to discuss the future of Southeast Asia energy trajectories and to discuss the implications of these new NDCs. I'll introduce the three speakers first, and then we'll have brief presentations from all of them. In terms of the Q&A, we'll be using the Q&A function in Zoom, and so you please leave those. And after the presentations, we'll have an opportunity for some questions. So first off, we have Karti Napathi, who is a PhD student in mechanical and aerospace engineering at UC San Diego, where he applies engineering tools to explore political economy questions. His current research, which he's going to speak about today, focuses on the industrial power sector decarbonization, focused on Indonesia, and on power market reforms and cross-border electricity trade. He holds a master's degree from UC San Diego and a bachelor's degree from Purdue University, and he has professional experience in the Southeast Asian power sector. Our second speaker, Manchi Dao, or Tyson, is pursuing a PhD in mechanical and aerospace engineering here at UC San Diego, focusing on energy systems. His work includes system modeling and policy analysis to explore the institutional, policy, and operational requirements of the energy transition. He is interested in ASEAN decarbonization pathways, focusing on Vietnam. And more broadly, he's studying the system needs for scaling up clean energy technologies, including geothermal and offshore wind. And he holds a master's degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering from UC San Diego. And then finally, we have Tu Vu, who's a senior energy analyst at TransitionZero, where she leads the power sector transition analytics for Southeast Asia. And her work sits at the intersection of climate technology and policy, bridging TransitionZero's data products, which are excellent, and energy system modeling tools with the region's most critical planning and investment priorities. And over the past 6 years, Tu has authored in-depth research on energy policy and clean investment trends in the region with a focus on Vietnam and Malaysia. And Tu will be joining us very late for her, so she gets a pass in case of any errors in this webinar. With that, I'm going to turn it over to first Karti to give us our first presentation.
Thank you, Michael. I'll just quickly share my screen. Okay. Hi everyone. I'm Karthi from UC San Diego's Power Lab, and today I will talk about the decarbonization of Indonesia's captive industrial generators and how that connects to the country's new 2025 NDCs or nationally determined contributions. So there are two parts to this talk. First, I'll walk through the landscape of captive power, what it is, why it matters, and also what our modeling shows about near-term pathways. Then I'll reflect on how these insights relate to Indonesia's updated climate goals. So captive generators are power plants built inside factories or industrial parks, supplying energy only to the facility itself. In many cases, it can be connected to the grid, means there are some power exports or power imports available. In the Indonesia's case, they are mostly off-grid. And another way to say captive power plant is also industrial self-generation, where the industries can self-generate their own energy. Um, in Indonesia specifically, there are 23 gigawatts of captive power capacity, and about that 15 gigawatt is from coal. And surprisingly, another 14.4 gigawatt of captive coal capacity is already under development. This means that captive power now represents roughly a quarter of Indonesia's total installed capacity. We can Another way to say it is actually Indonesia now operates a second power system growing in parallel to PLN. The growth of captive power has been extraordinary. Between 2015 and 2025, captive coal grew at 26% per year, and 73% of this capacity serves the nickel processing industry, which is a backbone of a global renewable energy supply chains. Indonesia produces nearly 40% of the world's nickel. So the energy choices in these industrial parks actually shape the carbon footprint of EVs, batteries, and stainless steel worldwide. Captive power is slightly more difficult to decarbonize compared to the regular grid generators, because these industries usually operate 24/7. So they are often energy intensive. They require a reliable and constant power supply. They also require very high reliability to keep the processes going on. And they also may require high grade heat or a continuous power supply that renewables cannot offer. So like usually coal is used to like produce very high temperatures for this metal processes and also other needs. Captive power plants may operate under different regulatory environments in most of the countries, so they are not really covered by the national climate targets and also the grid company's targets. So they don't always get the same support from the government, also the grid company in terms of decarbonization, because they also operate under a different investment cycle. And in Indonesia specifically, captive coal plants are sometimes located in remote areas with inadequate grid infrastructure. So there's not really an option for the captive plants to connect to the grid and import the power from the grid. But that doesn't mean the policy is not evolving in Indonesia. So, Presidential Regulation 112 that was released in 2022 was mainly about retirement of coal-fired power plants, which placed a ban on all coal-fired power plants unless they're contributing the economy of of Indonesia. So, in this case, captive plants can be allowed to build under this framework as long as they commit to reduce emissions by 35% within the next 10 years through a variety of technologies, carbon offsets, or in some cases, RE blending. And also, they must commit to cease operation in 2050. Meanwhile, the Energy Transition Partnership, which was signed by the G7 countries along with Indonesia, it brings international financing with targets for a 2030 coal peak and also 34% renewable energy generation, and also bringing forward the net zero goal of Indonesia from 2060 to 2050. Importantly, the JETP Secretariat is now conducting a dedicated captive power study, which shows a signal that this system is finally entering national planning discussions. Ooh. So our research asks a very straightforward question. How can Indonesia's industrial parks decarbonize their power in the near term in alignment with Indonesia's clean energy goals and while keeping the cost manageable? So we split this problem into two. So we are mainly evaluating the decarbonization pathway for these captive generators. We compare different combinations of on-site upgrades and grid connection to maximize clean energy adoption. And also we look at financial requirements on how much it would take to actually decarbonize and where the cost is allocated, whether it goes to the government or the grid company or the captive owners itself. So our model treats each industrial park as its own system. So like we separated this model into two. I won't spend too much time here. I will just say what this model basically is doing. So like this model is co-optimizing grid and industry. So grid is operating as its own system, and every industrial park is operating in a separate system with their own constraints. They have their own demand, heat demand, and also um, heat demand and the demand, and also like uh, their processes constraints. And on the grid side, we got the data from official documents in Indonesia. And for the industry side, we procured our data from different sources. And at the same time, we also assessed if the industrial park can build their own solar power plant or wind power plant or a geothermal power plant. So we did some resource assessment around that area to find out how much capacity is available for these captive generators to actually decarbonize by building new renewable energy plants. So we took all these inputs, we put into a least cost generation transmission expansion model, which informs what the investment decision should be for the target year. So in this case, we modeled it for 2030 and 2035. So I will go straight into what we found out from this study. So we found out that up to 35% of clean energy is already feasible in the industrial parks, which can come from a combination of captive renewables and grid imports for the year 2035. We also found out the grid upgrades are needed, but they are manageable. So grid connection for industrial facilities does require upgrading the bulk grid by up to 10% for generation side and 16% for transmission side. The hybrid scenario where the captive power plant can connect to the grid or they can choose to build their own captive renewable is the cheapest option when we consider the cost of captive coal, but it is not exactly the cleanest option. Captive coal remains for heat-intensive industries. They cannot be retired immediately, unfortunately. And especially for nickel and aluminum smelters, that does require high temperature heat for the processes. And finally, this grid imports, where the captive power plant can import power from the grid to meet the energy demand. They are sensitive to the import purchase price. So we found out that a 21% increase in the purchase price decreases grid imports by 32.4%. And this actually promotes more on-site goal, signaling that there needs to be reform on the tariff design for these industries. So we released a national report with all the data, much more details about the research brief that I gave for everyone, scenario results, and also our open source model. We just launched our report a couple of days ago, and there's a QR code here that links to our report, which provides more information. We've also linked our GitHub repo if anyone's interested in looking at our technical assessment on how we conducted this study and what is our model, where our data comes from, and how our data looks like. It can be found in our GitHub. Okay, now let's take a step back and look at the national climate picture in terms of the second nationally determined contributions of Indonesia. Indonesia released its second NDC in October 2025. This version actually makes a major improvement. So the previous version, which was the enhanced NDC submitted in September 2022, it used the business as usual percentages to indicate greenhouse gas reduction targets. But this year, they expressed the targets as absolute emissions. This actually shows transparency and also setting a more concrete and also more achievable target by actually looking at like very absolute numbers. So in the terms of low carbon compatible pathway, which is Indonesia is on right now, it's 1.345 gigaton CO2 emissions by 2030. And also in a higher growth where there's bigger economy growth, they have a target of 1.49 gigaton of CO2e. And for 2035, for the first scenario is 1.257 gigatons. And also for the second scenario with the higher growth is 1.48 gigatons. So which shows that the emissions are projected to peak by 2030. So the move away from business as usual, it sends quite a powerful message to the international community. Like I said, BA scenarios can shift with assumptions and they can make reductions look larger than they really are. A real baseline like what Indonesia has set right now, it really does the opposite. It sets accuracy and accountability. It also tells the international community and the Indonesian public that there is a starting point, which is the 2019 reference year. And also, we are committed to like reduce to this absolute value. So let's also talk about where these reductions are actually coming from. So Indonesia has separated the emissions reductions into sectors. So the first and the most significant one is forestry and land use. This is where the main source of emissions are coming. The second one is energy sector. It is showing some gradual transition, but it is also showing that coal is still dominant. And for the industries, there are slower change, mainly due to link to critical minerals, like I mentioned, nickel mining, which is used for batteries and also other renewable energy technology. Um, which makes sense because Indonesia's industrial base is expanding, especially in minerals. So these sectors are tied to Indonesia's long-term development vision, and they actually carry a greater economic promise. And finally, agriculture and waste, they are modest, smaller and steady contributions. Um, compared to other sectors. So when we take a step back, each sector contributes in a way that matches Indonesia's current development priorities. So in this way, the NDC just doesn't reflect the climate ambition of Indonesia. It also reflects the country's economic story and where the country is entering, where is the country going for the next 5 to 10 years. So looking ahead, we can see that Indonesia is in the middle of a transformation. There are new economic activities, new mineral processing hubs, new supply chains. It's all reshaping how the economy is going to look like in the future. And in the middle of this transition, there's a new character came into the picture, which is the captive coal. It's interesting because captive coal sits in the intersection of self-generation, industries, energy, and also future of Indonesia's economy. So it is remarkable because when we simulate the systems, we find something hopeful. Like I mentioned, that they can already transition to significant share of their cleaner energy, but it is not exactly reflected on the current NDCs. So we do hope that future NDC iterations may benefit from more explicit integration of these developments, specifically for the energy sector of the industries. So I do want to leave with a question for the audience. Um, so how might Indonesia's next climate strategy may bring grid and industrial energy systems closer together so that economic growth, energy security, and decarbonization move in the same direction, closer to the NDC targets, second NDC targets. With that, I would like to pass it back to Michael. So if you have any questions or comments or feedback, please feel free to reach out to me through my email. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Karti. And thank you, Karti, for reminding me. I neglected to mention that the research presented today in Indonesia and Vietnam is posted and available on our website, the Power Transformation Lab, or pwrlab.org. Thank you, Karti. Okay, so we'll pass it over to Tyson Chi.
Sure, that's excellent. I think I will need permission to turn on the video, I think. All right. Okay. Well, thank you, Karthi, for and Michael for the introduction. I think Karthi's sharing is very relevant, and I mean, I'm sure a number of us here are looking at COP30 and looking at all the events that are going on, as well as this wave of NDCs coming in. Um, in the case of Vietnam, to the best of my knowledge, we haven't really submitted the NDC update, but I was at a government consultation for NDCs the other day, and I can tell that they are trying very hard to navigate, all the different potential avenues that different sectors can take, but particularly the power sector, where we are looking at a number of new options, types of generators, technologies that were not previously have not previously been deployed in Vietnam, such as batteries, nuclear power, thinking about, how do we move the question of offshore wind regulation and deployment ahead, and all of that. So I think Vietnam is being very careful and trying to develop different pathways and be more certain about certain commitments. And I guess in a similar fashion, that also partly what inspired us to start this project on power sector decarbonization pathways in alignment with JETP, which is in the nearer term for 2030, but also looking in the medium term of NDC in 2035. And so that's the topic that I'll be sharing about today, sharing some of our results as well as the relevant policy recommendations. So just to quickly set the stage. This figure shows electricity used in Vietnam by sector since the 2000s, and then you can see that the industry rose very quickly, and now it's the takes a lion's share of the demand. And the takeaway here is that any realistic decarbonization pathway will have to work with a very fast-growing, industrial economy. And then on the supply side, we have been traditionally very dependent on fossil fuel, particularly coal. We've been thinking about gas, plan to deploy quite a significant amount of combined cycle gas turbines, but that comes with its own problem. And then starting in 2018, we see a sharp increase in solar and wind driven by generous feed-in tariffs, but there were also issues with that as well. The tariffs being a little bit too generous, and then now we kind of struggle a little bit on seeing how to navigate procuring a significant amount of renewable energy, but kind of balancing it out and accounting for the interests of different stakeholders in the process. So with that backdrop, we also have the timeline of Vietnam undergoing a rapid energy transition. We had the resolution 55 back in 2020 that, now there's kind of a new resolution that is an extension, but also something that stresses on energy security, which was actually just issued in August this year, resolution 70 by the Politburo, where it highlights, the importance of energy security, and also provides it provides the directions of trying to diversify our generation technology options, and then we see that as like a signal for a very rapid transition from this point onwards. And then between the resolution 55 and resolution 70, we had the JETP, we had the revision of the power development plan, which also took a while and many drafts to finalize. And then between that, then the JETP is going along, and now we're looking at how to, convert something that carry a lot of potential back in 2022 and really turn it into realistic projects and, put the investment where it will be most useful. And so with that view, we look ahead to not just 2030, because that's where the JETP targets are aimed for, but also 2035, which is what we are looking at for the NDC commitments. And in order to, I guess, have that view, then you would need to have some type of modeling, some kind of scenarios that provide insights. And so in the literature, there are a lot of good models, but most either don't start from PDP-8 with the most up-to-date directions, which actually changed very significantly since the 2023 version, or there would be some other areas that they haven't sufficiently covered to answer all of these questions. So our goal is to build an early capacity expansion model for 2030 and 2035 with unit commitment details calibrated to the modified PDP-8 and explicitly implementing the JETP constraints. And by doing that, it helps us address a number of questions. So what would be the effects of the JETP targets on the optimal mix in the context of the shifting policy landscape where, for the 2025 PDP version, there's a significant shift into allowing the deployment of flexibility resources like single cycle gas turbines, like batteries, storage solutions, batteries, pump hydro storage, and then also, the removal of the restraints on utility solar deployment and also the emphasis on rooftop solar. Very, very, very ambitious goals. And then we look ahead into 2035, but looking at different starting point for 2030. So we look at the path dependencies of these scenarios. And then finally, we look closely at the performance of these new technologies as are the technology highlighted in both the PDP, the latest PDP, which is represented by decision 768, and then also the resolution 70, which highlights the will of the country to move towards a more diversified mix of power generation technologies. And this is our model formulation into 6 zones. We deployed a number of scenarios for 2030, a number of scenarios for 2035. We did some clustering and some relaxation for computability. And this is just a number of scenarios we run for 2030, and we basically did it on a 2 baseline, really comparing the direction Vietnam was going with in 2023, which is a low flexibility, likely high gas dependence, to a higher flexibility and higher VRE deployment. And then we had those 2 different starting points. And then moving into 2035, we also take different starting points and different points in 2030 where we end up with different amount of carbon emission. So we have a BAU, we have a carbon emission level aligning with that in JETP, and then we had even a tighter cap aligning with another JETP target that implies a tighter carbon emission level. And then we also place a baseline where if we fall into what we call a system under stress situation, and what that means is that historically, Vietnam has had years where we suffer some blackouts due to harsh conditions, such as a higher than expected amount of demand, but low hydropower output, low ability to import, low hydropower, both on site and on the import side. And so we had that for 2030 as a baseline, just to see that even if the system is stressed out, how does that affect the dependencies for 2035? And then for each of the baseline, we have a number of variations going from different constraints on emission for 2035, demand sensitivity, a reduced battery cost, and a coal phase-out trajectory on an utilization rate basis. And so just to get into the quick findings. So we found that for JETP, the RPS target is the most binding. And actually, out of the 3 targets for JETP, it's the one that really bring the emission level down to 124 million ton, which is even significantly lower than the other target within the JETP set of targets, which is 170 million ton. And if you see on the scatter plot, you can see that there's almost like a linear relationship where each extra percentage point on the RPS displays a fairly constant amount of coal generation. And also, there's a linear relationship between that and the carbon emission target, which later will have some implications on our recommendations on how the target should be set. The next finding is that we found that the role of flexibility resources, such as single cycle gas turbine, battery, and PHS is very important, both in reducing total system costs as well as reducing the LNG sensitivity. And the motivation for this is that there are a number of years where LNG, the price for it could fluctuate by a lot due to geopolitical factors. So if a system is more dependent on LNG, then it's more sensitive to LNG cost change. But the issue with it is that there are certain type of technology like combined cycle gas turbines when if you commit to a certain amount, there is a minimum offtake requirement, could be historically 50% for Vietnam. Now in the regulation is 65, and then a lot of investors even arguing for even higher numbers. So if you make those investments for gas turbines, then effectively you are locking in a certain amount of LNG combustion, which then makes the system more sensitive. So what we actually found was that if we are able to deploy flexible resources, that in turn helps us integrate more renewable energy into the mix, then we can tackle that and actually reduce the LNG and therefore the dependency and the cost sensitivity to varying LNG price changes. And then this is a chart that we demonstrate this relationship where we use the P series versus the A series, where we had less flexibility versus more flexibility. And if you look at the black line, you can see that the total amount of locked-in emissions significantly dropped. If you look at the height of the bar charts, you can also see that when the LNG price increase between the first and the second and the third and the fourth, there's way less the delta cost, the change in cost is way less for those scenarios where we deploy a lot of flexibility. And then this is just a chart that demonstrate on the peak days during the year, the peak RAMs, meaning between 1 hour and the next, what was used effectively to meet the RAMs, and again, highlighting the very important role of flexibility. And actually in this case, we highlight the role of battery because it can actually serve on both the flexibility for flexibility purposes, but also on storage purposes, which takes us to the next finding, which is that when we put in storage solutions, we can bring in more renewable energy. And that's actually even more highlighted in the stress conditions that I mentioned previously, which is the high demand, low hydro, low import scenarios. And so when we do that, if we cap the utility solar or capping storage, it forces the model back into fossil fuel consumptions, and then both system costs and locked-in emission rise. When we lift those caps, then it allows much higher renewable shares at a lower cost, even under the stress condition. And I think it's very important that we bring in this stress condition, because that shows that we are looking at all the contingencies, and even to satisfy the energy security objectives of something like Resolution 70. And then this is also another sub-finding that we had, which is that we found, even for Vietnam's current policy, which is that there's supposed to be a 10% minimum storage capacity at every new utility solar deployment, and that's assumed to be on-site. We did find that the ratio of battery over solar is actually the optimal ratio could be even higher. But what we also found is that it would actually be more optimal if you place the storage resources nearer the demand centers and not necessarily where you deploy the solar. So the difference for that is that because in Vietnam, geographically speaking, the central and the south has higher solar potential, but the two main demand centers in the north and in the south, and the center that usually lacks electricity or blackout happens more is actually in the north, because we have congestion sending that electricity from the south to the north. So now the finding is that if we place the storage resources in the north, and then we can deposit that electricity in the north before it reach peak hour and all the congestion hours, then it can really utilize all the additional electricity that we generate from the renewable energy rich regions in the south, and then use it to supply for the north. But in order to do that, then it has implications on whether the regulations require the storage resources to be placed in either near the generation source, or the decision is to place it near demand centers. But this is our findings actually point to the later being the more optimal. And finally, also something very important here is that we often hear that there's always a comparison between decarbonization targets and economic and how the economics work out. And the argument sometimes for opponents of decarbonization would be that this costs more money, decarbonization costs more money. Right? And sometimes that may be true. So in our case, well, of course, when we add a tighter carbon emission cap, then the system may actually incur more capital investment, for example, for renewable energy, which was the case for our 2030 model, but we actually found that the cost only rise between 1.5 to 2%. But so that's not too surprising. But what actually is more interesting is that we found that if we start with a more ambitious 2030 carbon emission level, and we select a relatively tight 2035 carbon cap, then the total system cost for both years, so 2030 plus 2035, actually becomes lower, and that is robust across all of our most of our starting points. Both of our variations, so 2035. So if you look at every group of 4 bars, if you look at the first 3 bar and look at the red dot, look at the dot where it's the total system cost by 2030 plus 2035, you actually see that the C series, which is where you have a more ambitious 2030 baseline, when you arrive at 2035, the total 2030 plus 35 cost is actually lower. So this is very important because it tells us that if we front load the clean energy, clean power capacity in 2030, it may cost more initially. But when you get to 2035 and you're trying to meet some type of carbon emission target, the total cost of 30 and 35 is actually lower. So that is a very important argument to make. And so this is a summary of our findings, and we basically group it into 2 big messages. So on the target side, the RPS is doing, it's a binding target, and it has a relationship, almost a linear relationship with carbon emission. And on the topic of carbon emission, we find that if we front load with PV and BSSS by 2030, then it actually keeps meeting the 150 million ton goal for 2035, which is what the 1.5C disaggregated on a regional level would actually cost a lower sum. And then second, on the system design side, we found the very important role of flexibility and storage resources in both reducing total system costs, increasing operational performance, and at the same time reduce the locked-in emission and the dependency, as well as the sensitivity to LNG price changes. And based off of that, we had a number of recommendations, both in terms of publishing, how we should publish, or I guess how we should come up with targets for Vietnam on an RPS/carbon emission basis. And then also, now that we know the importance of these resources, serving flexibility, serving storage, then there are also recommendations on how we should create favorable market conditions for those to be deployed. And also, specifically on the topic of storage, we would recommend, guiding regulations towards not making it compulsory that storage resources has to be deployed next to the generation sources. And then, of course, very importantly, being ambitious with the targets, even as renewable energy target, even as soon as 2030 can actually have very good payoff by the time we get to 2035. So I will stop there, and we're happy to share our policy brief that's already uploaded, as Michael mentioned, and hopefully very soon the data and the model. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tyson. Okay. And before I pass it over to Tu for our final presentation, just letting everyone know we'll get into the Q&A after this, so feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom to get some questions in there right afterwards. Okay, Tu, over to you.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you, Karti and Chi, for all of your great research. I think just a quick intro again about my company and what we're doing and how that relates to the topic of these seminar. So TransitionZero, we're building energy systems modeling software that it's accessible to no-code users. We understand that most analysts working in the energy transition space, especially in Southeast Asia, do not have access to energy system modeling tools or university computers as you do. But most would be better off if they could, back their work with modeling-based evidence. So beside building these platforms and software, we also conduct some bespoke research projects in Southeast Asia regarding regional interconnection, clean energy procurement by corporates, CFE schemes, carbon-free electricity schemes, which we've published in the past year. And I'm going to tie some of the findings of those research as well as our monitoring and understanding of the policies and market structure changes in Southeast Asia with the research that Karti and Tyson has shared. There are several crossover themes and findings. Yeah, I'm hoping to bring the perspectives and findings from other markets in Southeast Asia, not just Indonesia and Vietnam. And first, yeah, I gotta say, most of our research also chosen the modeling horizon similar to what the other two panelists have done with their models, 2030 or 2035. This is not too far in the future, but it's also not too close. So it means there are possibilities for changes to be introduced, for scenarios to be explored, but also we have kind of a clear view of the possible scenarios to assess and compare the trade-offs and costs and benefits. And on the first theme that I want to, I think, share a bit here about corporate decarbonization, which is a part of what Karti's research was about, even though Karti, your study is on Indonesia captive coal sector, and they're very energy intensive consumers, which is perhaps the most challenging and extreme case study for industrial decarbonization in the region. If we could, just take a step back, and I may bring some light into the picture about, how corporates and their sustainability goals have played and are likely to continue to play a notable role in driving renewables adoption in Southeast Asia and support, overall power system, energy system decarbonization. If you look at CNI rooftop solar development in the region, the numbers are quite impressive in markets like Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia. It's an often overlooked segment, but with the right policy enablers, in some cases, they've reached about 30 to 40% of national solar install capacity. And if you look at the bigger movements that we read on the news, corporates have been aggressively pushing for large-scale clean energy procurement, asking for corporate PPA scheme, which will likely be driving solar and wind growth in the coming years in the region. And these are very novel mechanisms if you consider that most of the electricity markets in Southeast Asia are highly regulated and dominated by one single buyer. So the regulatory and market reforms that were needed to enable these schemes have not been easy to develop. There have been headaches to the regulators, but there have been some really encouraging developments in markets recently in Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand. Why is this important to monitor and to assess the impact on national targets, NDCs? I think it's reasonable to expect that a significant part in the renewables build out in the coming years will come from corporate PPAs. And national utilities will be playing an intermediate role, collecting wheeling fees in exchange for, granting third-party access to the national grid. And similar to Karti's research in Indonesia, one of TransitionZero's study really also found that there are co-benefits at the system level if corporates aim for more ambitious sustainability targets. On one hand, they'll have to build more renewables to meet their demand, and provided that they'll be able to sell back the excess unused electricity to the main grid, this can result in system-level savings and emissions reduction, mostly because the main grid will be able to avoid the burning of fossil fuels and fossil fuel electricity. And this is what we found for studies in Peninsula Malaysia and Singapore. And second, on the main grid decarbonization outlook, because the main grid can support corporate decarbonization only if it's also decarbonizing itself fast. So what are the expectations in this aspect in the near term? Because the context is that there are still countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, where the penetration of coal and gas in the generation mix still remains very high, up to 80 or even 90% in some cases. And there are challenges, while there are challenges with near-term coal phase out. And on top of that, as Michael said, we are expecting high demand growth in some of these countries. So what happens to the renewables targets of 2030, 2035? Some of these countries, they don't have that ambitious targets, like Malaysia and Indonesia. And in others where the targets are super high, the pace of implementation, it's actually not that encouraging. So it's very hard to expect that they will be meeting those targets in the near term. However, I'd like to mention this recurring theme in the region the past few years, which is the growing interest in cross-border electricity trade for main grid decarbonization. If you remember, Tyson's presentation and also his remarks, is that Vietnam is exploring, a lot of options: solar, rooftop solar, wind, offshore wind, and a lot of other technologies, domestic, indigenous. That's because Vietnam, it's like one of the most like ideal market to model, because the pathways can be so diverse. We have so much indigenous resources, renewables resources to explore. But other countries in the region, they don't have that many options, and the options are not that diverse. Peninsular Malaysia, they only have like solar, and Singapore, they're land constrained. So the ability to deploy and to decarbonize to like net zero level for them, it's not possible with domestic resources. And that's why for most of these countries, the interest in cross-border electricity trade, in connecting their grids with the neighboring sources of supply, even though we are very ambitious, subsea cables has become very important. And I want to avoid putting this under the umbrella of the ASEAN power grid at the highest level, because it's unlikely that all of these proposals will lead to the formulation of a fully integrated regional grid in ASEAN being realized anytime soon. But it's very possible that some of these bilateral interconnectors will progress much faster than we've seen historically. And TransitionZero model very recently that we've published for Singapore shows that Singapore's main grid could raise its renewables share from less than 3% to 10% in 2030 if the interconnect with the solar plus battery farms in Batam, Indonesia, will be realized as planned by 2030. I'm happy to share more during the Q&A, but I'll stop here for now. Back to you, Michael.
Thank you so much, too. That was excellent. Okay, so let's everyone turn back on their videos, and we can get into some questions. And just a reminder, if folks have questions online, you can use the Q&A section of this. So I think, first off, the climate conference is ongoing, and there's always a really important discussion about financing. And so I guess I want to first come to you two and ask, in terms of the international financing, what are countries in the region asking for and saying in terms of their financing needs? We've, of course, had a little bit of a rocky start to the Just Energy Transition partnerships with the exit of the United States and some other financing not arriving. So, too, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think at least if let's narrow it down to like JETP Vietnam, right? I think we've all seen the the phased or the priority areas or the priority projects and the categories of financing that was assigned to a lot of the sectors, the segments under the energy transition framework. And I think it was not expected that all of them will materialize within just a couple of years. But so far, I guess the likeliest scenarios has happened, which is that the financing for some grid projects have moved forward. For some very highly prioritized pump storage projects have also moved forward. And to be fair, the discussions for all of these loans preceded the JETP announcement. So they just, I think, got a boost to be really to materialize and gotten the support from both the IPGs and also from local stakeholders that those are really the priorities. And yeah, I think they've all been disbursed under state so SOEs loans non-guaranteed by the government. So it's still usually the most preferred financing route for our government. So I think it's made both sides happy, but the question is how further and if those loans are going to be further, scaled into like new deals and new projects. We all know the priority projects, they're still there. But yeah, if those loans can be scaled and replicated for the upcoming deals.
Yeah, and we saw the announcement just last month between the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank committing in excess of $12 billion to support the regional interconnections. That seems like a pretty significant commitment towards the interconnection parts of the work that you discussed. Yeah. And I invite other folks to reflect on that as well, but I'm going to ask another question here, which is, we talked a lot about coal, right? Coal is still a mainstay, but new coal development in the region is slowing, right? We've seen commitments, in Vietnam's latest PDP to reduce the coal capacity. We've seen commitments on behalf of Indonesia to phase down, phase out coal. And the international financing for coal is drying up. So now there appears to be a dash for gas. And that seems to be the main potential complication on the route to increasing clean energy deployment in the region. So I'm curious, and maybe I'll start with Tyson, but invite others to reflect of how are the gas supply plans evolving, and what are particularly volatility of LNG, and what are the big concerns and potential conflicts here as countries are reshaping their energy strategies?
Yeah, so I think one of the key constraints to gas development is establishing a supply chain. So initially, back in 2023, when the first PDP came out, and we had big plans for just a large amount of capacity for CCGT to be deployed. And right after that, Vietnam got to start establishing supply chain, building terminals at ports to import. But largely, that has been it has been behind the progress and behind what would have been necessary to achieve what PDP planned in 2023. And then the shift, I guess in part as a response to that in 2025, is that now the planning for gas has been reduced as we also open up the opportunities for other types of technology, as I mentioned, flexibility based, even gas, but gas with single cycle gas turbine, which serves a different role in the mix. Then it's kind of like a pivot from an initial plan for high reliance in gas to a lower reliance, but not completely singling it out. But still, the constraint here remains establishing the supply chain, and also it's and all the delays, and that also matters because it it depends on the international supply and the bilateral contracts that we may have to sign to secure that gas, and there are also geopolitical influence. Let's say Vietnam, US relationships. Vietnam may be buying LNG from the US, and so I think that's the first thing. But embodying the spirit, increasing energy security for Vietnam, I think Vietnam is looking into diversify these options for generation. And then in terms of the concerns, potential concerns, the issue with gas and especially gas consumed by combined cycle gas turbine is that, as I mentioned before, there may be minimum offtake that is already in Vietnam's regulation, and typically there's a figure between 50 to 65%, and some investors are even arguing for higher levels. And so if someone is going to invest into a plan and the plan is going to have a minimum offtake for 10 years, as is in the current regulation, then that is a fixed minimum amount of gas that's going to be consumed, which is problematic because, first of all, it locks in emission, and the second, there's an opportunity cost for committing that much. Now that later on, as we want to deploy more clean energy, or if cost of clean energy decreases, then we still there's an opportunity cost that could have been if we had deployed a lower amount of locked-in resource. And then the other thing is because the variable cost of running this combined cycle gas plants is basically just the cost of LNG. And the cost of LNG, as we've seen, over the COVID period and during some of these geopolitical shifts, could be very variable. It could, double in a year and then comes back down, in a few months. And so that's kind of the risk, right, that is associated with the theme of energy security. And also, if you're locked in, then your system is more sensitive to that price change. So that's the other second concern talking about gas.
Yeah, thank you, Tyson. So we had a question come in related to Indonesia. So I'm going to direct that to Karti and then also piggyback on maybe one last question for the panel. So the question to you, Karti, is for high temperature heat, are there options such as small modular reactors that could provide some of these, additional energy sources that are scalable for these areas? And then for the whole panel is, and maybe we wrap up with that is, I think we've talked a lot about the potentials and we've talked a lot about the ambitions and as is well known, cost-effective renewables are quite abundant. Solar and batteries are getting very, very cheap, and the alternatives in the region are getting more expensive. So what are the non-cost challenges to scaling up RE in these various regions? What is preventing these potentially very cost-effective technologies from being deployed more rapidly? So, Karti, over to you on the SMR, and then that question, and then maybe we can go to Tyson and then to Tu to wrap up on the last question.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So I will answer three questions actually, including the gas question. So on the SMRs, Indonesia is at the very beginning stage, but it's also important to look at the ownership structure of this industrial parks. So like most of these industrial parks or industrial facilities are owned by China or different countries like the European countries, or even in some cases, the United States. So the implementation of SMR really boils down to whether the captive owners want to build an SMR in their industrial parks, which could also spearhead the SMR introduction of SMR to the entirety of Indonesia. The government is also looking into SMRs, which was revealed in their recent business plan for electricity supply up to 2035. And on the gas side, why gas cannot replace coal in Indonesia is because there is an absence of pipeline. So for those of you who know how Indonesia looks like, it has a very complicated geography, so many islands, and so the population is scattered out through these islands, and the gas pipeline is not really developed in most of these islands. So that is why gas production, gas generation is still stalled in Indonesia, but like they are looking to improve it. And on the financing side, on the development of RE side, um, in Indonesia, the main cost right now, the main hidden cost right now is land acquisition. So large scale renewable energy like solar and wind, they do require a lot of land to build these renewable plants. And the land acquisition cost is just like really high in Indonesia, which discourages investors and developers to build renewable energy plants.
Great, thanks. Tyson, over to you.
Sure. So without getting into the specifics, I would say some of the major constraints would I say in Vietnam and probably many other Southeast Asian countries grid, both the all the congestions going from geographically potential sites to as we talk about demand centers, which may be elsewhere. And then I think other things can be market regulations and favorable conditions to adopt new generation technology types. Also, things like offshore wind, it's very regulation dependent. Um, and then I think a very important element here would be the international cooperation. So the knowledge transfer and the skill transfer to adopt some of these technologies, learning from other countries' experience, and just financing all of that. I think that is the direction that Vietnam has been actively moving in the last 1 or 2 years more rapidly, and I think that's a good sign.
Yeah, as the last point, I think I echo quite what Karti said, which is a competition with other economic sectors for land. When you build like large-scale solar farms, I think that's probably the case in Peninsula Malaysia, where you have high demand centers growing in like parts of Johor, where it's also, other economic activities there. So if you really want to get those like data centers there, clean energy, they'll have to be built elsewhere. And that means that the corporate PPA schemes and, TNBs or the regulators' regulations on corporate PPAs, virtual PPAs, physical PPAs will have to be really enabling for that. And yes, regulatory, it's a big challenge in the region. We're talking about very highly regulated markets. Even if you're building, self-consumption or, on-site solar farms, that requires a lot of permitting and alignment with national or local PDPs. So it really varies across markets, but there is a common theme with regulation and support from the utilities as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for such a rich discussion and for sharing your insights and research. And thank you to the audience as well for joining us. We've provided our contact information, and please stay in touch, and we'll all be watching carefully how COP30 evolves over the rest of the conference. All right. Thank you all, and have a good day and night.